The station was alive with sound, heels striking against the polished floor, the hiss of brakes as another train arrived, the endless murmur of voices blending into a restless hum. She stood on the platform surrounded by strangers, her suitcase in hand, lost in the blur of routine. Yet, in the midst of all that noise and movement, a single glance was enough to tear her world apart. Her breath caught before she even realized why. Just beyond the crowd, standing half in shadow near the edge of the platform, she saw him. The shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, even the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, it all slammed into her with brutal familiarity. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed that it was impossible, that she must be imagining things. He had been gone for years. He had died. She had mourned him, buried him in her memory, and learned to live with the hole he left behind. And yet there he was. The world around her seemed to slow. The announcements over the loudspeakers blurred into meaningless noise. The rush of commuters dulled into silence. All she could see was his face, a scar cut across his cheek, jagged and raw even after healing, a permanent mark carved by war. It should have made him look like a stranger, but instead it drew her in, like proof that he had survived something unimaginable. His eyes met hers, and in that instant everything collapsed. The grief, the denial, the years of trying to forget. Her fingers went numb, and the handle of her suitcase slipped from her grip, falling heavily onto the floor. The sound echoed louder than it should have, jolting her back into her body, but not enough to break the trance. She could feel her heart pounding, not with the excitement of seeing him, but with the terror that he might vanish again if she blinked. Her knees trembled, and she clutched the edge of a nearby bench to steady herself. The last time she'd seen those eyes was in a hospital tent, in the chaos of a night filled with sirens and cries. He had smiled at her then, even as he lay pale and bloodied, promising her he would return. Hours later, news came that his unit had been lost in an explosion. They told her there were no survivors. She had believed them because she had no choice. She had lived with the memory of that smile as both comfort and torment. And now, against all reason, that same smile hovered faintly on his lips. Her first instinct was to run to him, to throw herself into his arms and feel that he was real. But her body refused to move. Fear anchored her where she stood. The fear that, if she touched him, he would dissolve like mist, a cruel illusion conjured by her longing. The station became a stage, the crowd of strangers just faceless extras as the space between them stretched like an ocean. He did not move either, though his eyes never left hers. There was something in them she had never seen before, a mixture of sorrow and apology, as though he carried not only the burden of survival, but also the guilt of returning. Around them, life went on. Children tugged on their mothers' coats, travelers hurried to their trains, vendors shouted over the noise, but she felt suspended outside of time. The smell of iron and oil from the tracks filled her lungs. Mixing with the faint scent of his presence, she thought she had forgotten. Every detail carved itself into her memory. The worn jacket he wore, the way his hands curled slightly as if ready to defend himself, the uneven rhythm of his breathing. He was alive, yet not the same. The scar told a story she hadn't heard. Each line across his face was a word etched by survival, each shadow in his gaze a sentence left unfinished. She wanted to know what he had endured, what he had seen, what pieces of himself he had left behind to stand here now. But more than anything, she wanted to know why he hadn't come back sooner, why he had let her believe he was gone, let her bury him in her heart, and build her life on the ruins of his absence. Her throat tightened, and tears threatened to spill, but she held them back. She had promised herself long ago that she would never cry for him again, never give her heart to a ghost. Yet here he was, and she felt that old wound rip open as if it had never healed. The scar on his face mirrored the scar in her soul, visible, raw, impossible to ignore. The train on the opposite platform roared to life, its whistle piercing the air, shaking her out of her stillness. People surged forward, and for a terrifying second, she lost sight of him in the crowd. Panic shot through her chest, burning hot and wild until the bodies parted just enough for her to see him again. He hadn't moved. He was still watching her, his eyes soft now, almost pleading. Her hand lifted without her realizing, trembling in the air between them, reaching for something she wasn't sure she could touch. And in that small, fragile gesture, the years of silence, the unanswered questions, the grief and the longing, all of it coiled tightly, ready to shatter the moment one of them dared to take the first step. Her hand still hovered in the air, suspended between hesitation and longing when he finally moved. Just a step, slow, deliberate, as if each inch of distance closed required enormous strength. The crowd surged and shifted around him, bodies brushing past, but it was as though none of them saw him. To her, every detail sharpened, the uneven rhythm of his stride, the limp that hadn't been there before, the way his shoulders curved forward as if he was carrying weight far heavier than the duffel bag slung across his back. When he was close enough, she could see the scar more clearly. It ran jaggedly across his cheekbone, disappearing into his hairline. Not a clean surgical line, but one carved by chaos. Shrapnel, fire, or worse. It startled her, not because it disfigured him, but because it made him real. The man she thought she had buried had lived through something that left marks deeper than the ones she could see. Her chest tightened at the thought of the nights he might have spent alone, wondering if he would ever make it back. He stopped just short of touching her, the kind of distance that feels intimate, not because of closeness, but because of restraint. His lips parted, but no words came. His throat moved as he swallowed hard, searching for a beginning. For years, she had imagined what this moment might be if it ever happened. The words he would say, the explanations he would give, the way her heart would either soar or shatter. But reality was messier. His silence was louder than any apology, louder than any promise. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions at once. Where had he been? Why had he not sent word? Did he know she had waited at the gates for weeks, clutching every telegram with trembling hands, praying for one that said he was alive? Did he know how she had screamed into her pillow the night they told her he was gone? The words fought their way to the surface, but her mouth refused to shape them, because beneath the anger and the ache was something she could not deny. Relief. He was here. He was alive. And in that simple fact, every other question burned away for a moment, but relief was quickly replaced by confusion. His eyes, dark, tired, rimmed with sorrow, didn't just carry the look of a soldier who had seen too much. They carried guilt, not the kind that comes from surviving when others didn't, though she sensed that too. This was heavier, personal, a guilt tied to her, to the promise he had made the night he left, to the vow he had broken by letting her believe he was never coming back. The station's lights flickered briefly, a shudder in the old wiring, and she was pulled back into memory. She remembered the night before he had shipped out, the lantern on the porch, his fingers brushing hers as he whispered, "Wait for me. No matter what. Wait." Those words had been the anchor of her days, the single thread holding her together through every headline about the war, every hushed conversation about casualties. And now, seeing him again, she felt the cruelty of it. She had waited. She had kept the promise. But had he? He finally spoke, his voice hoarse as if unused. "You look the same," he said softly, almost reverently. It wasn't what she expected, not after all the years, not after all the pain. The simple words carried both awe and regret, a quiet recognition of all that had stayed the same while everything else had changed. She blinked hard, her throat tightening around the flood of emotion that threatened to drown her. Her gaze flicked down to his hands. They were rougher now, scarred and calloused, veins raised beneath weathered skin. She remembered those same hands once tying ribbons into her hair, once smoothing the pages of books they read together under the trees. Hands that had touched her gently, tenderly, as if she were something fragile. And now those same hands bore the proof of battles fought, of nights survived in places she couldn't imagine. She lifted her eyes back to his and saw him looking at her with a question unspoken. It was in the way his brow furrowed slightly, the way his lips pressed together as though holding back something that might undo him. He seemed to be asking without words if she still saw him, not the scarred soldier, not the ghost returned from the war, but the man she had once loved with the innocence of someone who thought love was invincible. A train screeched into the station, the vibration rumbling through the platform, shaking loose the moment like shards of glass rattling in a frame. The crowd pressed closer, jostling them, forcing her against him for the first time. The brief contact sent a jolt through her body, an electric reminder that this wasn't a dream. His warmth, his solidity, it was all real. And yet, the question hung there, unanswered, as raw and cutting as the scar on his face. Would she let him back into her life? Or would the years of silence and pain keep them apart, even now? She opened her mouth, finally ready to speak, but just then his gaze darted over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. Something, or someone, had caught his attention in the crowd. She followed his eyes, scanning the sea of strangers, but saw nothing unusual. When she turned back, his expression was guarded again, the softness replaced by the alertness of a man who had learned to never feel safe for long. And in that change, she realized there were more secrets hiding in his silence than she was prepared to hear. The moment his expression shifted, she felt the floor tilt beneath her. The softness that had lingered in his eyes only seconds before was gone, replaced by something sharper, harder, a soldier's gaze honed by years of survival. His body tensed in ways she recognized even without having lived through war herself. The way his shoulders stiffened, the way his jaw locked, the way his eyes scanned the crowd with quick precision. It was the language of someone who had learned to trust instinct over logic. And if his instinct told him there was danger, then she knew something was wrong. She tried to follow his gaze, searching for whatever it was that had unsettled him. All she saw were people moving, dragging suitcases, checking their watches, hugging loved ones goodbye. Ordinary movements in an ordinary station. Yet he stood rooted, his hand hovering just inches from hers, his breath steady but measured as though bracing himself. The scar across his cheek seemed to tighten with the tension in his face, an old wound awakening in the presence of unseen threat. When his eyes finally came back to hers, she saw it clearly. Fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from uncertainty, but the kind of fear reserved for someone you cannot bear to lose again. That realization hit her harder than any words could have. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. "Walk with me," he murmured, his voice low and strained. He didn't take her hand, but the command in his tone left no room for hesitation. She followed him through the throng of passengers, weaving between bodies, her heart racing. Every step brought more questions. What was he hiding? What had followed him back from the war? And why, after all these years, was danger still written into the lines of his face? They moved out of the station and onto the rain-slicked streets. The air was damp and cold, the smell of wet asphalt sharp in her nose. He didn't slow until they reached a quiet side street, away from the noise and rush. Finally, he stopped beneath the dull glow of a street lamp, his back pressed against the wall as though he needed something solid to hold him upright. For a long moment he said nothing. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, shallow and uneven, mingling with the faint drip of rainwater from the rooftops. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of years compressed into a single sentence. "I wasn't supposed to come back." The air seemed to leave her lungs. She stared at him, waiting for the rest, but he looked away, his eyes focused on something only he could see. He spoke slowly, as if pulling the truth out from the deepest part of himself. He told her about the night of the explosion, how his unit had been ambushed, how he had been buried under rubble while others didn't survive. They had marked him as dead because there had been no chance of survival. And, in many ways, he admitted he had died there, because the man who came out was not the same. But that wasn't what unsettled her most. It was the next part. He confessed that he hadn't tried to reach her immediately, that there had been reasons tied to shadows of war, to debts and promises he couldn't break, reasons that left him carrying both the scar on his face and the silence that had torn her heart apart. She listened, torn between relief that he trusted her enough to begin telling the truth and rage that he had let her believe he was gone. Every word felt like reopening an old wound, peeling back scabs she had tried to protect. She wanted to scream at him for the nights she spent waiting, for the years of grieving a man who was still breathing. But when she looked at him, she saw the torment in his eyes. His absence hadn't been a choice made lightly. It had been survival, sacrifice, and shame all braided together. The street lamp flickered overhead, buzzing faintly, and in that brief dimness, she saw the full fragility of the moment. He had returned, yes, but the war was still with him. It clung to his skin, to the way his shoulders never fully relaxed, to the way his voice faltered when he spoke of the past. He was a man alive in body, but haunted in soul. She wanted to reach for him, to touch his face, to remind him that he was still human, still hers in some unbreakable way. But the question burned in her chest. Could she forgive him? Could she accept not only the man who had returned, but also the secrets he carried, the ghosts that would forever stand between them? Before she could ask, he finally looked back at her. His eyes, dark and raw, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart stutter. "If you stay," he whispered, "you need to know the truth. All of it." The promise of what lay beyond that confession was both terrifying and irresistible, because the truth he held wasn't just about the war, or the scar, or the years of silence. It was about something deeper, something that could either bind them together again or break them more completely than the war ever had. The silence that followed his words stretched long and heavy, the kind of silence that doesn't just hang in the air but settles into the bones. She felt it press against her chest, urging her to respond, to demand clarity, to either forgive or condemn him. Yet her lips refused to form words. She could only stare at him, at the lines carved deep into his face, at the hollow shadows beneath his eyes. He looked older than his years, not just in body, but in soul, as if he had lived a dozen lifetimes between the last time she saw him and now. Finally, he drew a shaky breath and began. His voice was low, uneven, as though each memory had to claw its way out of him. He spoke of nights when he wasn't sure if dawn would come, of comrades who whispered promises into the dark only to vanish by morning, of carrying letters in his chest pocket, letters never delivered because the hands that wrote them no longer existed. He told her of being pulled from the rubble not by medics, but by strangers who operated in shadows, men who didn't wear uniforms and didn't fight under flags. They offered him survival, but at a price. His silence, his disappearance, his name erased. As she listened, the ache in her chest deepened. It was as if every truth he revealed was another weight pressing down on her heart. She wanted to interrupt, to tell him he should have found a way back, that love should have been stronger than secrecy. But something in his expression stopped her. It wasn't defiance, it was regret, pure, unflinching regret. He hadn't chosen to abandon her. He had chosen to live, and living meant carrying the unbearable cost of letting her mourn him. She thought of the years she had spent grieving, how grief had become her companion, how she had shaped her life around the absence of him. And now he stood before her, alive, his heart still beating, his voice still speaking. The contradiction threatened to undo her. Could she reconcile the man she had lost with the man who had returned? Could she accept both versions of him? Knowing they were bound together by scars she could not see? The street lamp flickered again, and she realized her hands were trembling. She clenched them into fists at her sides, desperate to anchor herself, but the storm inside her only grew. She wanted to touch him, to confirm that he was flesh and blood, but she also wanted to strike him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain his silence had caused. He seemed to sense her turmoil. He stepped closer, cautiously, like a man approaching a wounded animal. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered. His words were soft, but they cut deeper than if he had shouted. Protecting her? By disappearing? By letting her believe he was gone forever? The idea twisted inside her, part of her wanting to laugh bitterly, another part wanting to believe him. His hand lifted slightly, as though he meant to touch her cheek, but he stopped midway, fingers hovering in the air. She could see the hesitation, the fear that if he touched her, she might recoil, and for a heartbeat, she didn't know if she would. Around them, the city moved on, indifferent. A car passed at the far end of the street, headlights flashing briefly, casting their shadows long against the wall. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, its echo stretching through the damp night. These ordinary sounds felt surreal against the weight of the moment, like reminders that life continued while their world stood still. She finally found her voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "Do you know what it was like for me?" Her question trembled in the air, raw and fragile. His eyes closed briefly, as if bracing himself against a blow. He nodded once, slowly. "I thought about it every day," he admitted. "It's the reason I'm here now, because if I carried it any longer, it would destroy me." Her chest tightened. The vulnerability in his words, the naked truth of his guilt, cracked something in her resolve. For so long, she had imagined this moment as one of rage or closure, but now it was neither. It was a collision of grief and love, of pain and recognition, of everything that had been stolen from them and everything that might still be salvaged. And yet, beneath the tenderness of his confession, she felt another undercurrent. He hadn't told her everything. His pauses, the way his gaze kept shifting toward the shadows, the edge of urgency in his voice, it all hinted at truth still buried. Secrets not yet revealed? She could feel them pressing against the edges of his silence, waiting to surface. She stepped closer, until the space between them was charged with the weight of all that had passed. Her hand lifted, this time deliberately, and she let her fingers brush against the scar on his cheek. His breath hitched, his eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of longing and fear. The scar was warm beneath her touch, rough but real, and for the first time she let herself believe fully. He had survived. But survival was only the beginning, because in that quiet, fragile moment, she understood that the war he had carried back with him wasn't just his alone. If she chose to let him in again, the ghosts he bore would become hers too. And before she could decide if she was strong enough for that, he exhaled a truth so sharp it stole the air from her lungs. "They know about you." The words sliced through the night, and with them the fragile illusion of safety shattered. Her breath caught in her throat. The weight of those 4 words, "they know about you," hung between them, heavier than the damp night air. For a second, she thought she'd misheard him, that her mind had twisted his confession into something darker, but the look in his eyes told her she hadn't. There was no mistaking the tension in his voice, the way his shoulders squared as if bracing for an attack. Whoever they were, she understood immediately. They weren't just part of his past. They were here now, closing in. The air around them suddenly felt different. What had been the ordinary quiet of a side street now carried undertones she hadn't noticed before. The faint echo of footsteps too measured to be random, the whisper of movement behind distant windows, the hum of a car engine idling just out of sight. Fear slid down her spine like ice. She wasn't prepared for this. She had spent years building a life without him, mourning him, trying to stitch herself back together. And now, not only had he returned, but he had dragged with him shadows determined to finish what the war had started. He saw the panic flicker across her face and immediately reached for her hand, gripping it firmly, grounding her. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but steady, each syllable deliberate. "This isn't about what you did. It's about what I carried back. They don't forgive men who walk away with knowledge they weren't meant to survive." His words made little sense to her, yet the urgency in his tone left no room for disbelief. She could feel the pulse in his hand racing, matching the quickened rhythm of her own. Her mind swirled with questions. Who were they? Enemies from the battlefield? Government agents? Mercenaries? Ghosts of a war that never ended? She wanted answers, but instinct told her this wasn't the time. Answers could come later, if later still existed for them. For now, survival was all that mattered. He tugged gently, pulling her toward the mouth of the alley, away from the flickering light of the street lamp. "We can't stay here," he whispered. She stumbled after him, her heart beat loud in her ears, each step echoing like a drumbeat of fate. The rain had started again, a fine mist at first, then heavier, disguising their hurried footsteps, but also blurring her vision. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly, every corner threatening to reveal danger. They reached the station again, now emptier than before, the last of the night trains having departed. The wide hall, once filled with noise and movement, was eerily still, the silence punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the loudspeaker. He scanned the shadows constantly, his soldier's instincts alive in every motion. She clung to his arm, torn between terror and the surreal comfort of his presence. At one point, he stopped abruptly and pressed her against a wall, his body shielding hers. She wanted to protest, but before she could, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Not hurried, not casual, but deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who already knew exactly where their quarry was. She held her breath, pressing herself into the cold wall, her pulse hammering. The footsteps grew closer, then paused, as if the person were listening. For a moment, she thought she could hear her own fear betraying her. But then, after an agonizing silence, the sound receded. He exhaled slowly, his lips brushing against her ear. They're testing how close they can get. It wasn't just the war he had brought back with him, it was an unfinished hunt. And now she was part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. Her eyes met his in the dim light. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he had come back if it meant putting her in danger. But another part of her, the part that had waited, grieved, longed, couldn't. Because even in this chaos, even in this fear, she felt the pull between them as strong as it had ever been. And maybe that was why the danger was so relentless. Love like this wasn't just a bond, it was a target. He straightened, his jaw set with resolve. "We can't run forever," he said. "Sooner or later they'll force us to choose." His words sent a chill down her spine. She realized then that this wasn't about hiding, or even surviving. It was about confrontation, about facing the past that had returned in flesh and shadow, about deciding if the love she still felt for him was strong enough to withstand the storm bearing down on them. The station's clock struck midnight, the chimes echoing like a countdown. She tightened her grip on his hand, her fear mingling with a strange, fierce determination. If their story was to be rewritten, if the scar on his face and the wound in her heart were to mean anything, then perhaps this was where the true battle began. And as the echoes of the chimes faded into the night, she knew that the next moment would decide not only their future together, but whether they had any future at all.